what SAF can learn from renewable energy, and how our credit cards are related to a mechanism helping to solve the SAF problem. That's something that Adam Klauber is explaining to us in this episode of Impactful Voices. Thank you for joining to Impactful Voices. Impactful Voices is a podcast hosted by Impact on Sustainable Aviation. Here, we will speak to industry leaders and leading voices across the whole aviation sustainability ecosystem. In today's episode with Adam, we have been talking about the financial challenges that SAF is facing and how the Market Accelerator Indicator, an initiative that he himself is working on, is trying to solve some of these problems. Adam leads the Sustainable Operations team at World Energy. Also, he is the elected board chair of the Roundtable of Sustainable Biomaterials. Previously, he was with Rocky Mountain Institute as chief architect of the first of its kind SAF certificate concept. As you can tell from that, Adam has already worked a lot on SAF in his life. And what I just told you is by far not everything that he's done. There's a lot more. But that is exactly why I'm so excited to have Adam here today to speak with me about the SAF financing challenges. Hi, Adam.
Hello, Leonie.
So nice that you join us today. Thank you for taking the time. We're going to speak today about the SAF financing landscape and then specifically what World Energy, the Market Accelerator Indicator that you are piloting, could contribute to the challenge that SAF is facing in a financing perspective. So to start, before we dig into the details and the technologies of the MAI, maybe set the scene a little bit with the SAF finance challenge overall. A few weeks ago, I spoke with Ken Hill about the policy landscape of SAF in North America. So it's great to now have you here, and we're going to talk about finance. So kind of like puzzling the pieces together. And despite, at least in some parts of the world, we have strong policy momentum on SAF and growing demand as well because of those policies. But we still don't see the finance landscape following up enough, at least at a pace where we would need it to fulfill these demands. So can you maybe, from your perspective and your experience, tell me what is holding back investment into SAF and why is the capital not flowing at the pace that we would expect it to?
Thank you. Yeah, and right, we need to be going a lot faster. So the fundamental challenge with sustainable fuels and sustainable aviation fuel in general is that it costs significantly more than conventional fossil jet fuel. So we've got to find a way to cover that differential. And the primary challenge is airlines have limited ability to pay. It's a low margin industry. It's very competitive, and any single airline that goes out too far in advance of the pack, it really is exposing themselves because they're going to have costs that they simply can't cover, and that's not viable for that company. So we've got that challenge that the conventional customers for sustainable aviation fuels simply can't pay the full price for them. That's one element. The second element is even if they were to make a commitment, right, they sign a contract, they are used to 1 to 3 year durations for their agreements. And for fuel producers like World Energy, we need longer term offtake. We need 10 years or more because that commitment will then translate to reduced commercial risk. So banks will say that's a bankable investment. And airlines generally don't have the credit ratings to support bankable investments. So we've got this challenge that the conventional customers for sustainable aviation fuels simply can't pay. And even if they were able, they would not be able to convince the banks that they were creditworthy.
Okay, when you say bankable investment, can you define what that means? What does it take to make SAF bankable?
Yeah, so there likely has to be a technology that's proven, and this was part of a study. So you had mentioned there is the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials project to recognize these bankable investments. And before that study or project that happened at the same time was the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI's Blueprints for Bankability. They talked to a number of banks to understand what do they need to provide capital and to provide capital at favorable rates. And banks said, well, first of all, we need to minimize the technology risk. So the conversion technology, right, taking the sustainable feedstock and processing it and refining it requires a certain technology. And for oils, for lipids, that's proven. It's called hydroesters and fatty acids, the HEFA process, and that is seen as lower risk by banks. So the banks want to make sure that, one, the technology is proven. Ideally, they would also prefer that that operator, the company who's developing the refinery, has experience with the technology. So they know the ins and outs. They can optimize, manage for technology risks or engineering challenges, and then deliver at a reliable service, reliable supply at a expected flow rate. Like that, those are pieces of the puzzle. So we need to have the proven technology, we need to have a proven operator. And then the last piece of the puzzle is one that this project with RSB was trying to solve, and that's to manage commercial risk. Because of the fundamental price challenge, the banks need to see that the offtake, right, that the contracts that we sign as fuel producers are minimize the risk. They want to see longer duration, and they, again, want to see a counterparty that is a low to minimal credit risk. So that is important. And what we are doing to advance, let's say, the scalability of a bankable investment by working with RSB is for them to create a standard from these insights so the banks can make it easier on banks, and banks can say, look, this is a creditworthy counterparty. It's a bankable offtake. They've managed commercial risk. They have 70% of their future supply for the next 10 years covered. We are able to give you capital at competitive rates, and it checks all the boxes.
Okay, so a lot of pieces that have to come together to make it bankable. Now, I've been working with aviation now for a few months, so I kind of a little bit start to understand about SAF landscape. Before that, I didn't, and I think it's nothing people know in their daily lives. So I remember you submitted an article for our year in review publication, that one. And there you made a reference to renewable electricity as an example. To basically learn from other sectors. Now, I think renewable electricity most people can a little bit relate to, and we have seen a massive scale up of those over the past decades. Is there something that SAF could learn, like lessons that they could take away from the renewable energy sector when it comes to unlocking that finance and making it bankable?
Very much so. In North America and other parts of the world, the conventional developers for solar and wind should be the utilities, right? The electricity providers. However, what customers were seeing, end customers, the operators of buildings were seeing, was that utilities were pretty slow to develop wind and solar assets. So that slowdown was addressed by what's known as the Power Purchase Agreement, PPA. So the power purchase agreement is a long-term contract it's unconventional. It's between that building operator and the developer. So it's a way to spur and accelerate investment in renewables without the conventional buyer or investor, which should be the utility. And so the reason why that's a helpful model is because we've got this similar situation in aviation. The conventional buyer should be the airlines. We've already talked about why that's difficult because they don't have the ability to pay. So we need an unconventional buyer, and that again could be the end user. It's the corporate traveler. It is the corporate air cargo customer. Both of those groups may have different ability to pay. And in fact, we've seen that with the purchase of SAF certificates from different management consulting companies, accounting companies, hyperscalers like Google and Microsoft, and some of the new media companies like Netflix. They have a different profit margin than airlines, and they still have responsibility and commitments to decarbonize. So if they want to decarbonize, they can wait passively for airlines who are unable to pay, or they can take a direct role. And so this is where we see the value from wind and solar, that the majority of installed capacity in the United States is linked to these power purchase agreements. So could it also be possible that the majority of contracts are also covered, at least in this early stage, by these business end customers who have an ability to pay? So that model seems very promising if we can extrapolate it from wind and solar.
Okay, but does an end user like you or me, if we're traveling privately, have to fear to bear the costs, or is it really just corporates that you're talking about?
A little while ago, I was involved with carbon offsets, and carbon offsets, for those who are less familiar with them, are projects to reduce carbon outside of the sector, right? Emissions reduction, it could be a tree, it could be a cook stove for a family instead of burning wood, but it's growing carbon or it's potentially reducing the carbon use through another measure. And the average traveler in the United States did not buy carbon offsets. This simply was not a priority. So let's say that's the consumer market. We believe the consumer market will lag with the purchase of sustainable aviation fuel credits because they can't buy the fuel. So we think that first businesses need to move. These goals, there again, public goals with groups like Science Based Targets Initiative. They have the corporate commitments to reduce their emissions. There is a lot more scrutiny on them, and many of them are leaders and are willing to go above and beyond even what would an average expectation for emissions reductions. So we believe, this is the change model from World Energy, that the corporates and the business customers will be the mobilizing force. Customers, like the general consumers and flyers, like you and me flying on leisure. Yes, it's great if we participate, but it's not expected, nor is there a good way to aggregate or to group together all of the demand on that consumer side, so that the average, let's say the leisure traveler, may have a very modest amount of emissions that they need to reduce. It's difficult then for them to say, I would like 50 liters of sustainable aviation fuel, World Energy. Can you find a way for us to get that supply? It's far more effective and efficient for us to work with long-term corporate offtake who are buying millions of liters, tens of millions of liters in 1 year.
Okay, great. Good news for me, at least, and probably most people listening to this. Is there, when we're drawing kind of the comparison to renewable energy, I'm curious to know, can we say we're kind of in the same stage, similar stage that as renewables were 10, 15 years ago, or are we lagging behind that?
That is a great question. I would like to think that there are certain elements that are actually farther ahead because we can learn from the insights and more rapidly iterate. So I think there is reason to believe that we are farther ahead with some of the models. So we have, again, that power purchase agreement. If we can build an analog for aviation, we have a working template. We don't have to potentially change it as many times as was done for wind and solar. So I think in that way, we may be ahead. We may be behind wind and solar in that these projects require greater capital. You can put a wind and solar array up for $1 million or less. A refinery is hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially billions of dollars to get to an effective scale. So it is harder to unlock that type of capital. There are fewer places that you can build them because of siting requirements, and you can't just put a refinery on top of a roof. That would be ideal, and maybe in someday we might be able to, with electrofuels, shrink the scale down to put it as a modular unit on a property like an airport. But right now it needs a dedicated development zone. So we have some added challenges when it comes to infrastructure that are more difficult to wrestle with than wind and solar has. So I would say in that way, we might be behind. We also, besides unlocking capital, which is really critical and at the heart of this discussion, we need to find a way to also make it easier to make projects. And there is a challenge with interconnectivity for wind and solar that we don't have for refineries because we're dealing with liquid instead of electrons. But the molecules that we have to deal with still have to get transported. So we still also need potentially new infrastructure, new pipeline connections to efficiently transfer our product. We have some other challenges with infrastructure besides just the capital.
Okay, perfect. You already jumped onto the next topic that was up. So Great. That is the infrastructure, because obviously it's the bankability barrier that we just discussed. But then it seems to me, from what I've always heard about now, learning more and more about SAF and the challenges, it's somehow like a vicious cycle. It's people like airlines don't want to sign offtake agreements because it's so expensive, but if they don't sign them, they can't be scaled at a commercial scale. But the infrastructure is lacking, so they can't really make use of enough SAF as they should. I hope I explained the vicious cycle a little bit correct.
Yeah.
So, one mechanism that I've now heard a lot about is book and claim in that context.
Yeah.
But maybe I'll give it over to you again to explain what book and claim is and how that could help solving that infrastructure problem.
Thank you. Yes, this entire system really rides upon the shoulders of what's known as a chain of custody system. So, chain of custody is a way to ensure that the buyers of a product are receiving the product right at the end of the supply chain. And the one that people are most familiar with might be what's known as like a segregated or dedicated supply chain, where those molecules or the materials stay together in a bundle, move through the supply chain. Let's say it's bananas, and we know where the farm was that grew them, and we know that they were transported on a certain vessel and they were delivered to a port and then eventually brought to a supermarket where you can buy them, right? So that the banana stays whole, it stays in its bunch, it's easier to track and trace. That is, let's say, the dedicated segregated model. There are other models that when you're dealing with commodities, such as fuels, where you have measurements along the supply chain where you might not actually measure the actual liquid, but you know the percentage of the material that's going through, say, a pipeline. So if I was to put sustainable aviation fuel, a blended fuel, into, let's say, a pipeline in Louisiana, that would, at 40% of the volume going into a certain pipe, then 40% of the volume in that pipe could be considered SAF, and that is what's called mass balance, to measure the percentages of certain volumes along a supply chain. Now, the ultimate freedom, and the one which raises most concerns with people, is when you can't measure the molecules, you just are focused on the credits. And so that is a system called book and claim. And while there are concerns, unfortunately, the concerns are diminishing over time as people get more comfortable with a book and claim or credit transfer. We can then have confidence, the customers will have confidence, and the demand will grow for credits. And before we think that credits is a crazy thing, I should maybe explain first, how does book and claim work for fuels? So for fuels, you have the physical product. Let's say it's the neat SAF, and neat SAF means unblended, right? It's the pure sustainable aviation fuel. Then blend it with a fossil product. And in the case of sustainable aviation fuel, it must be blended so it can be used with aircraft engines. At the point of blending, the blender can then take the credits, the emissions reductions that would be associated with the neat SAF, the pure SAF, and move those along a separate delivery supply chain, right? So they can put those onto what's known as a digital registry. The registry is operated by a third party who can then see that there's evidence that the product was produced in what's known as a proof of sustainability document. And that proof of sustainability documents gets submitted with the numeric information, with how much volume, what are the emissions reductions, and that gets transferred electronically, digitally, to a buyer. And the buyer can be confident that the registry has no other issuance for the same product, the same supply, and is operated by another entity, so there isn't the danger of potential collusion or bias. The registry wants to show that it's reliable. That's how it keeps doing business. Is a system that's been pioneered by the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials and quickly followed by some other registry providers. And it mirrors a system that has been accepted for decades, which is credit transfer, whether it's from banks to bank transfer or consumers to banks. We use credit cards. That really is book and claim, right? We have no paper
That's so funny,
money
yeah.
that's being exchanged.
Never
Yeah.
thought about this. Yeah.
So the book and claim system works for financials, and it can clearly work also for emissions reductions credits. So that's at the heart of this. So great question on the infrastructure. That then, if we have book and claim, it means you can be a buyer essentially anywhere on the planet for a specific volume of sustainable aviation fuel, and that gives us maximum potential for purchasing. And it then allows the buyer to buy the most efficiently produced supply, which is really important. So we reduce the logistics costs because now that fuel could be delivered to the airport closest to the
Mm-hmm.
refinery. And we have created the potential for a large pool of buyers as opposed to the limited number of airlines that may fly out of a single airport.
Okay, so thank you for the explanation because so far, if I would have had to explain book and claim, it's you book and claim the environmental benefits and then you don't have to worry about what's actually in your tank. So now it's great to know the actual technicalities behind all of that. Um, Now, I'm curious to know because it sounds so perfect. Now, you literally just gave the perfect example of our daily lives. We're using it everywhere and it works. What are the critics saying? Like, why might people not be convinced of that idea yet?
So there are concerns around whether or not there's accurate accounting. So if a transfer occurs, does it only go to a single party? If you use a digital registry, yes, that digital registry is only going to have one owner, but there is the possibility that a supplier could put their product on multiple registries, right? It's known as
Mm.
double issuance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a form of double counting. And obviously, it's fraudulent and it would weaken the trust in the system. So we need interoperability, which is a fancy way of saying that the registries have to talk to each other. And so they can quickly determine, oh, look, this particular delivery already showed up on my registry. Therefore, it can't show up on another digital ledger. That's really important because we want to avoid potential for error and fraud. The other area of concern is around the tracking and traceability. There are some parties that are less familiar with chain of custody documents for fuels, and they think some of the restrictions from wind and electricity are appropriate. And what is a restriction that I'm talking about? So in the grid, you've got different amounts of fossil sourced generation, right? You may have a natural gas power plant, you may have a coal fired power plant. Then you also could have hydropower, nuclear power, you could have wind and solar, all supplying part of the same part of the grid, but changing during the course of the day and during the course of the year based on the availability of renewables, rainfall, etc. So there is a requirement on the renewable electricity side to have regional production and to not buy renewable energy credits, the RECs, from any location, because what you may be doing is end up actually consuming coal fire power plant produced electrons and then claiming that you use solar because you 1,000 miles away have helped to pay for electrons in the desert. So this is one of the challenges with renewables on the electricity side. And there are practitioners who assume that the way for you to control risk would be also to require deliverability. So that means that, right, the buyer actually receives the physical product, which unfortunately negates the whole benefit of book and claim if you're making
Right.
that physical
Yeah.
requirement. So they have to get more confident with the documentation that exists and understand it better. And I would say, really, more than anything, it's an information and educational
Mhm.
challenge more than implementing something that doesn't already exist in the industry.
Yeah, I guess that's what we see in all parts of life. Oftentimes, when you want to introduce something new, there's a lot of hesitation, and people don't really like change and new things. So we just have to be convincing and keep pushing it forward. I think that's a good transition to now actually talking about the Market Accelerator Indicator and to talk about that initiative. Can you explain specifically all the problems that we now talked about where the MAI is setting on and trying to address the
Yes,
problems?
thank you. So the MAI will be a system, and I say will be a system because it's currently in a pilot stage with a few projects that are not yet announced. So the MIA will rely on long-term offtake between the creditworthy counterparty. So it could be like a hyperscaler, for example, or another party, a pharmaceutical company that can pay the premiums associated with the sustainable aviation fuel. And they will be purchasing the credits, the emissions reduction units, otherwise known as environmental attribute certificates. They'll be buying these credits from a producer. So that is part of this. And we'll also then need to find an off-taker or a buyer, in other words, for the conventional fuel volumes. Because what happens after book and claim is that when the SAF credits are stripped from the physical molecules, you still have the benefits, right? The energy qualities associated with the fuels. So part of MIA will ensure that those molecules, which are now just energy units as opposed to sustainable aviation fuel, that those have a buyer too. They're easier to sell because they can be sold at indexed market rates for whatever fossil jet fuel is selling for. But the bank needs to see, look, the credits are covered and the premium is addressed through this unconventional buyer, say the corporate buyer and buyer. And now the physical molecules, those are all covered by the airline. So we know that this product is taken care of. So we will need to have multiple of the contracts connected to a facility that ideally is before a final investment decision, right? So it hasn't yet secured all of the debt capital it needs. And this contract or multiple contracts will provide evidence that the product is being sold. So this is part of the process. And then the information should be provided to a bank or banks plural, and the banks can provide feedback and explain, yes, this actually reduces the bank's burden for due diligence because they know commercial risk is managed. There's a third party that has said what the requirements are for bankable offtake. There also then needs to be an audit. So we need the verifiers to say, look, this contract meets all the requirements of RSB's Market Acceleration Indicator. And then through our evaluation, we'll also see, did this reduce the burden on the banks as well? And then at the end of the process, the capital should be released to the producer at favorable rates. And that should be part of the evaluation at the end too, is to see, was that interest rate lower than it would have been otherwise because the commercial risk is managed. And once these pilots have been conducted and the evaluations are published, I think we'll have a good foundation of what this can do for scalability.
So did I basically understand it correctly that what you're trying to do is just changing the conventional order of how it usually would go? So instead of 1, 2, 3, step 1, 2, 3, you're kind of trying to target it, taking the conventional 3 to the beginning. And so changing that order. Is that correct? Simply said.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think for conventional refineries, yes, right. The demand, they're selling a commodity. Right? So if you can produce the commodity and we know there's a demand for that, then you don't have to go through all of these steps, as you said, two and three. But yeah, let's say if step 2 is signing on the customer for a book and claim contract, and step 3 is verifying it and unlocking the capital at favorable rates. Those are new steps that are not part of conventional refinery investments. So completely agree that, yeah, we're adding these steps and they're ahead of the final investment decision. And we believe ultimately that this is a way to make it more favorable economically for sustainable aviation fuels.
Is there maybe another example that you have from either a different sector where a similar mechanism has been implemented and worked, or is that something very first of its kind that we're trying to bring out?
Yeah, so it will be first of its kind for aviation when this is conducted. We do know there are other producers like the electrofuel companies that are signing these long-term offtake, and they have a general sense that this will help make them more bankable. So we've seen those signals in the market, but there hasn't been a formal system. So I think that is one of the exciting parts about this is we're getting to pioneer something new. But the overall premise, as we discussed earlier, is based on wind and solar with
Hmm.
the power purchase agreement. And one of the reasons that that power purchase agreement has been powerful is because it proves to the end customer, right, the building operator, that what they're doing in the marketplace is creating something additional, something that wouldn't be there but for their contract, that long-term contract for renewable electrons. And I think in that way, that precedent is really important in fuels too, because the buyers are saying, look, if we buy a product off the spot market, which means available credits that you can buy today, right? They're from short-term supply. You can't prove necessarily that they are additional easily, meaning they got produced, right? The credits exist. They already went into the system. But if you are signing a long-term offtake before before a refinery is actually built, you have very strong evidence that financially, a buyer's action, the procurement is additional. And that checks a major box. And that completely is borrowed from the solar and wind market that show what's called unbundled RECs. Those are the RECs, spot market renewable energy credits. Those are not necessarily financially additional and viewed with more skepticism. But bundled RECs, which are part of these long-term offtakes, those are seen as the gold standard. And we are building off of that model and believe that we're on solid footing there.
Okay, perfect. That sounds very exciting. So you just talked about this currently in the pilot phase. Is there already a deadline or like a date known, announced when you'll bring out the results of that pilot phase?
Ideally, it would be this calendar year. More realistically, it'll be first quarter of 2027. There'll be findings that can be disclosed. So that please be on the lookout for updates. But yeah, we still have a little while before we can share the insights.
Okay, perfect. I'm excited. Well, stay tuned and definitely announce it well, not if, we're positive when you'll release them. Maybe to wrap the whole conversation up, I think we've covered a lot of the different challenges and from financing and infrastructure and what different mechanisms they are and what you are working on to also be part of the solution. Now, I'd like to ask you one last question on if we look ahead 5 to 10 years, what needs to happen today so that we have SAF truly scaled at the level that we need it to? And how optimistic are you that we will get there?
Yeah, so I'll take the second question first. I am optimistic because we have to be. Like this is what right, makes me excited to start the day and keeps me moving in face of all the challenges. And clearly there are many.
Right.
So how do we get past this all? I think it's by thinking about that can do approach, right? It's what can an individual, what can a company do to make a difference? And then to execute on that. Obviously, there are financial realities that have to be addressed, but the underlying premise must be that we can meet these goals. And if that is the belief, I think that can help propel people into action. So I am firmly convinced that it is important to be idealistic. In fact, it really is the only way we're going to make a difference. So now, what needs to be done so that we can temper that optimism with some realism? And I think in that category, what we need to do is have an effective model for unlocking capital at favorable rates, right? That we got to check that box because there are already premiums associated with biofuels, right? There are actually two main branches of sustainable aviation fuel: those that rely on feedstocks from plant mass, and those that can potentially be produced literally from the air, electrofuels that take right CO2, the carbon from the atmosphere, and potentially hydrogen from water, and combine those to make a hydrocarbon. Right. So those are the two main types. When it comes to the biofuels, the feedstock is more expensive than fossil crude. So we want to reduce all the other costs as much as we can, supply chain logistics, infrastructure investments, et cetera, because we still have to grapple with the feedstock. So we need to find a way, besides lowering the capital for investments to get less expensive feedstock. And those often mean waste feedstocks or creative ways to grow more efficiently sustainable crops like intermediate crops, carinata, pennycress, camelina. These crops need to scale. And to do that, there needs to be, again, a signal on the demand side that there's willingness to pay. So if we have a system that's robust, where we have a growing number of companies that are making these voluntary purchases, that in turn will provide signals to banks to provide that capital at lower cost and enable entrepreneurs and existing companies to build infrastructure, and then to also convince the growers to release more or to dedicate more of their fields to growing these cover crops and sustainable crops, potentially even also on degraded land. However, we're not going to get there 100% of the way just from either growing our way to it or using waste oils. We have to find other ways to unlock cellulosic general biomass, like the main stalks and stems from plants. Those can be converted and need to be part of the mix. And so we also need to have some advances on the technology side for converting cellulosic biomass into fuels, and that is happening. It needs to continue to progress. So I'd say both of those pieces need to occur. Let's find a way to increase feedstocks for proven technologies, to advance the technology for other types of biomass. And then lastly, if we can reduce the cost of wind and solar, eventually electric fuels may be more competitive. Right now, an electric fuel is exceedingly expensive, 12 times or more, right, from fossil jet fuel. And that price has to come down to scale. And the only way it can is if we have less expensive electrons through potentially nuclear, wind and solar prices coming down. And it's a little difficult at the moment, given AI data needs and other end uses for electricity, like electric vehicles and electrifying buildings. There are lots of uses now for renewable electricity that fuels are competing with.
Okay, so a lot needs to happen, is what I'm hearing.
I was going to say, like, if there's a listener here who's looking for a career where there are significant challenges that AI will not displace, choose fuels, renewable fuels. We need you, and you're going to be needed for a long time.
Perfect. I think that's actually great to hear, because me, as a fairly recent graduate, has been facing troubles in the job market. So it's good to bring that message out where people can still find the jobs. Great. I'm really excited about this conversation. I think it's always nice now, having had more conversations, speaking to people that are optimistic, because I think it's easy to not be. It's easier to be pessimistic than optimistic. We have to be honest. It's always the easy way. So it's really inspiring and nice to have these conversations with the people working on the front of the transition and still being optimistic. So thank you so much for that, Adam.
It's been fun, Leonie. You had great questions.
Thank you. And everyone that listened and has more questions for Adam, feel free to reach out to us. We happily forward them to him. And I assume he's happy to answer them as well.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.